So our next presentation is with Nancy Ukai Russell. She's going to be talking about the acts of resistance at Topaz, and we'll just welcome Nancy.
Hello. Thank you for being here this morning, or afternoon, I guess it is. My name is Nancy Ukai. I'm a Sansei. I was born in Berkeley, and about 14 of my relatives were incarcerated at Topaz, including 2 half-siblings and 1 who died at childbirth. Today I'm going to be talking about acts of resistance at Topaz, and there are a lot of things where people exerted their agency in small ways, in petitions, in letters, in ways that may not have been fully recorded in the history, and then they get lost to memory. So I'd like to talk about acts of resistance in documents and monuments. And what you see on the screen are, I was pleased to find these, a letter in Japanese by an Issei woman, and then a monument made by Issei men. And I think it's really important, even we're on this pilgrimage to create memories, and we become our own new community of memory. So to the extent that you can look at this and think maybe about your own families or things that you heard about when you were a child or from relatives or from the community, that would be a good thing. So I am director of a website called 50 Objects. It's a National Park Service JAX grant, and we are looking at the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans through 50 artifacts. And actually, number 16 was this pile of dust, which we call the demolished monument, because in 2020, when there were big societal upheaval over Confederate monuments and the tearing down of monuments of white supremacy during Black Lives Matter after the murder of George Floyd, I thought, there's a monument built to James Wakasa, who was murdered at Topaz in 1943, and I knew about it because my mother spoke about it at dinner one time when I was a little kid. So I thought, we have a monument, and even though it's demolished because government records said nothing was left, at least it's our important memorial that we should remember. And so Dave Izu, who's the art director, went to Home Depot and got a bag of cement and poured it on some photographic paper and took a picture, because there were no photographs that we had of this demolished monument. And later we were to find that actually the monument still existed. So I'm actually going to start with a few anecdotes from Tanforan, because resistance to incarceration didn't start at Topaz. It started right from the opening of the first concentration camp at Tanforan. So there was an article in the June 1942 local paper, Appeal Made by Jap Woman. She was arrested by the FBI in Oakland, hiding. She was 32 years old. She was an American-born Japanese, and she sobbed bitterly in federal court that she had to go to, what she called an evacuation camp. Her name was Liwa Chu. Liwa Chu said she had hated her own people and never associated with them, but had considered herself Chinese, like her husband. She had had 2 Chinese-American husbands. I cannot help the blood in me, she said. She also had 2 Chinese-American children who were put in an El Cerrito orphanage, El Cerrito, California orphanage, and they actually never went to camp because they were kind of in this orphanage that was off the radar of the officials. Surprise reveal, Liwa Chu is my aunt. I never knew about this. I knew I had this aunt who was kind of the black sheep in the family, and in today's parlance, you'd say she identified as Chinese. But, she moved away. I never knew her. I did know her son, who became a well-known jeweler. His name is Samuel Paul G. But at any rate, Ernest Bessig, you can see the letter on the right, the Northern California ACLU attorney was getting involved in her case to some degree. She ended up at Tanforan, but another thing is, because she's under Chu, I never found her in the final accountability report. Anyway, then there's another article in the newspaper about 2 Japs evade evacuation. This is June 1st. In the Oakland Tribune, 2 Japanese men, one of them a man who had lived without food for more than 3 weeks, and the other a 23-year-old Oaklander who altered his draft registration card to identify himself as a Spanish Hawaiian were held in the Bay Area today for allegedly failing to submit to evacuation. The Oakland man is Fred Toyosaburo Korematsu, and of course we've heard Karen speak at the keynote, whose parents, former operators of an Oakland nursery, and 3 brothers now are at the resettlement center, meaning Tanforan and San Bruno. I don't want to go, he explained simply. In San Francisco, Koji Kurokawa, 38, Japanese-American handyman, was found in the basement of Simon Levitt, his employer. For 23 days, Kurosawa secretly lived in a corner of the dark cellar. He had no food, only water from a faucet. I didn't want to go to camp, he told officers. I've been confused because I'm an American citizen. So it turns out that Ernest Bessig, who was director of the Northern California ACLU, approached Korematsu, as we know, to be a test case to test the constitutionality of the incarceration. He also asked this guy, Kurokawa, who said, no thanks. And it turns out that people were hiding and getting arrested in Sacramento and in many places in the state. I'm only concentrating on Tanforan today. So 14 days later, and I asked Karen about this, you see the headline, Evacuation Law to Face Test, Civil Liberties Union to Fight Case for Hayward Japanese. And so Korematsu agreed when Ernest Bessig approached him and said, will you be a test case for the constitutionality of your incarceration? This could go all the way Supreme Court. Then Korematsu very bravely said yes. And asked Karen for more details, but Korematsu was incarcerated at Tanforan and Topaz. And we know what happened, which is that the Supreme Court in 1944 ruled that it was constitutional, and then many years later it was vacated, that decision, and Mr. Korematsu received the highest civilian honor that our country gives, which is the Medal of Freedom, which is depicted in the top right-hand corner with President Clinton. And, Fred Korematsu's bravery and courage and amazing ability to resist at that time when you're 23 years old, your 3 brothers and your father are in camp, is just astonishing, and look where it's taken us. And at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see Karen yesterday standing at the entryway of her family's barrack in Block 28. Very moving. And the highest honor, not the highest, but the most popular one among young people, a Google Doodle on his birthday. Okay, another example from Tanforan, then we'll move to Topaz. We want our community doctor. So in the National Archives in San Bruno, there is a petition of more than 100 Berkeley and Oakland Japanese Americans who basically say to the officials at the Tanforan detention center, we have had this doctor, Dr. Hajime Ueyama, as our family doctor for 12 years. Please appoint him to the medical facility. Unfortunately, it's undated, so don't know exactly when they did this, but apparently he was not on the medical staff as of yet. So I went through the 6 pages of signatures and was finding people I knew and people you know. For example, Chiura Obata, the artist, and his wife are signatories. On the left-hand side, Sugio Kubota is the father of a friend of mine. He was a gardener who had just finished paying the last payment on his brand new truck, which he then had to sell for nothing. The man on the very bottom, Juzaburo Furuzawa, that is his bonsai next to a descendant. And Furuzawa was at Tanforan, he was at Topaz. He started to create a bonsai out of a seed in a tin can. He was a no-no, and he ended up getting transferred to Tule Lake. He renounced his citizenship. He later withdrew that, but he continued to cultivate this bonsai, which is a super precious artifact, living, which is now in the Federal Way Bonsai Museum in Washington. And the top right-hand corner shows Nakao Kino, another Berkeley Japanese American who is American-born, and his family will be, his son, who I know, will be surprised to see that his father signed this petition. So there's a lot of, in the San Bruno archives, material about this doctor. And the center manager wrote in one of the letters, "It's come to my attention that Dr. Ueyama, on more than one occasion, has made statements to the effect that the center management was making money on the feeding of the residents. There was a lot of corruption in the mess halls with skimming off of food and selling it on the black market. On a number of occasions, he has refused to cooperate with the management, and I feel that his attitude is detrimental to the morale of the center." So Dr. Ueyama was, within the next month, in June 42, was shipped to Tule Lake. So that petition didn't have any, it maybe put him on the staff, but he didn't stay for long. He was sent with his wife and children to Tule Lake. Similar case where he was reporting of corruption in the mess halls and also complaining about the lack of facilities, the lack of equipment, and the poor level of the Caucasian doctors. In fact, one got transferred away after this. He then got transferred to Grenada, his third camp, where he stayed until the end of the war. And then he returned to Berkeley, and I talked to his daughter, who's 84, lives in Las Vegas, and she said, yeah, Daddy used to do house calls in the morning, and then he would be in his office in the afternoon. He was born in the United States in 1904 in Berkeley, and he helped an Issei purchase a property in his name because, Japanese nationals couldn't buy property. That same man, when he died in the 70s, in the family history, it says, we then called Dr. Ueyama. And then it turns out, I'm learning so much, my half-sister was delivered by Dr. Ueyama after the war. So in doing this research, I'm learning a lot about my own family history. So there's Dr. Ueyama in the top, in the first picture on the left. He's the young man in a kind of a bicycle. In 1912, 8 years old in Berkeley. In 1929, he's a UC intern, and in the 1970s, he's shown in his office in Berkeley. So let's move to Topaz. These are acts of resistance that we may have heard about a little bit, and today, you could do a whole presentation on it, but I'm just going to keep moving to show you that in the aggregate that people were voicing their anger over being incarcerated without charges and because of their race. So it may not be known by a lot of people that out of the 10 WRA camps, that Topaz was actually in the top 4 in terms of opposition to the loyalty questionnaire. And as you know, in the spring of 1943, a mandatory questionnaire, the single most destructive mandate of the incarceration, was to be completed by all prisoners 17 and older. And 2 questions in particular, the notorious number 27 and number 28, were particularly confusing, caused conflict, trauma, divided families, violence in the camps. And number 27 asked if you would serve the military anywhere where you're ordered, and number 28 asked for you to pledge your unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear allegiance to Japan. Now, of course, if you're an American citizen, you don't have allegiance to Japan. And then for the Issei, the immigrants who were barred from becoming citizens, their only country was Japan. If they forswore allegiance to Japan, they would be stateless. So lots of confusion, poorly worded. But what's interesting is, according to research done by James Okumura, who is a Jerome descendant whose family all went to Tule Lake, they weren't no-nos. They didn't fill out the questionnaire. They just didn't trust it, and they all agreed, we're going to refuse to answer. So that's yet another category. But at any rate, he has done pie charts showing all the different refusal rates of all the camps, and Topaz is number 4 of 10. In response to the registration and the loyalty questionnaire, a committee of 33 was formed at Topaz. And I understand that Topaz was the only camp that on the first day of registration, which if you did not do it, you could be subject to 20 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. At any rate, this committee of 33 wrote a very long letter, which they sent to President Roosevelt and a lot of government officials. And it was published in the Topaz Times, and you can see the headline, that registration proceeds, but they published the text of the resolution, which was quite strong, eloquent, thoughtfully written, and basically it said, we, the citizens of the United States of America, residents of Topaz hereby state, whereas we have temporarily surrendered many of the rights and privileges of citizenship. We have suffered losses of homes, properties, work, freedom of movement. We feel that a loyal citizen of one race should not be treated any different from another. We request President Roosevelt use his office to secure all constitutional and civil rights and disperse Nisei soldiers into the army at large, because the government was proposing a racially segregated combat unit. And there was a lot of resentment and that, Nisei, after being ethnically cleansed from the West Coast and then put in racial camps, concentration camps, then be sent to war in a racially segregated unit. But the military was segregated at that time for everybody. So basically what happened was their letter was patronizingly and kind of cursorily dismissed by the government. And in Satsuki Ina's new memoir, which was published in March, and in which she analyzes her parents' 140 letters and her mother's diaries throughout World War II. She wrote, 3 days after the resolution was sent, the Topaz Times published the government's response. The U.S. government has evidenced its faith in the loyal Japanese Americans by giving them the opportunity to serve their country. And she wrote, this dismissive doublespeak ignored every issue addressed in the resolution. So a lot of frustration, nothing new. In addition, there were Issei mothers, and I'm sure many of you know about this, more than 1,000 who signed a petition to the president, to the War Department, to the Supreme Court, and they wrote in 1944, so a year later after the loyalty questionnaire, objecting to their sons being sent to fight when the families were behind barbed wire, and they also objected to the racial segregation of their children. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's a list of all 1,141 people. That would be really interesting to see, but here we see 6 representatives, women, Issei women, who wrote a letter and presumably got it translated into English, the text of which is available in Mirashima Bukuro's book, and part of the letter says, we humbly request that our civil rights be restored to our children now. We trust that the government will keep faith with the democratic principles on which America was founded. And Yuri Miyagawa, who is a sansei in the Bay Area and has been doing a lot of research on these kinds of resistance, wrote to me, these ladies could have been our grandmothers. The voice of Issei were kept absent, not only because of the language barrier, but largely due to deliberate efforts by the government, and she wrote also, and the JCL. When I found out about these Issei women, it was incredibly inspiring. These women were well-educated, articulate, resolute, and sharp. So 6 months later, at Topaz, in the fall of 1944, another Issei mother wrote her own individual letter to the War Department. So you can see it's Mrs. Tome Takaha on the return address, Block 30, 3E, Topaz, Utah, and she wrote straight to the Secretary of the War. And this is really interesting. She wrote it in Japanese. So it's like, okay, you guys translate it. And basically, she had been very upset about the incarceration from the beginning, but this really drafting of the sons really upset her because she had 3 sons. And part of her letter, and this is interesting. So the War Department, the great-grandson, Tyler Peterson, pulled the file from NARA, from the National Archives, and he was in correspondence with Densho about this, and Densho said, yeah, look into this. And so what's interesting is, number one, the War Department is calling the camps concentration camps, and they're also saying things like, well, the attached correspondence is transmitted, and the writer has been, advised of this reference. And they basically are saying, well, 2 letters have been sent to her regarding the issues. I've therefore included that a reply to the attached letter would be unwise, and would only serve to promote a further exchange of letters. So you can imagine they're getting these letters, and it's sort of like they check the boxes and go, okay, we've done our due diligence, next. This is Tome. This is probably taken after the war. And her great-grandson has been talking to relatives and said she was pretty fired up and she was active in dissenting against their incarceration. She was getting more vocal about it because her 3 oldest boys were eligible for the draft. But when she, then he just wrote to me, this was around the time that the government was starting to draft from the eligible men in the camps, and she was getting more vocal about it because her 3 eldest boys were eligible. After her letters went out, and after the 3 boys had filled out the questionnaires, she sat down with my Uncle Nidge and tried to convince him that all 3 boys should refuse and not go serve in the army. He was the spokesman for the 3 brothers. You can see the internal family conversation going on. And he talked with Tome about how the 3 boys didn't want to be sent to Japan as renunciants for answering no and refusing to be drafted. That was the fear and the rumors that they had all been hearing in camp at Topaz. He said that the uncle said they only knew America and they knew nothing about Japan and they didn't know anyone in Japan, so they would all serve so they wouldn't be sent away. It was after that talk that she got very disheartened and stopped attending meetings. She was also taking care of my great-grandfather Zenichi at the time, as he suffered from several strokes while they were in the camp. So that was the end of her activism in camp. The 3 boys did end up serving in the military, and one of them, at least, was in counterintelligence and eventually went to Japan to help during the reconstruction after the war. I think he did end up meeting his grandmother, Tome's mother, and a few of our relatives that had remained in Japan. So what was really valuable about this was to hear the backstory of how the family was dealing with the decisions about the questionnaire and enlisting. So these are some documents which give you a little peek at the kind of granular of different acts of resistance. And I'm now going to switch to monuments and memorials, physical things. And what you do see in the camps, all of them, are stones being used as a symbol of material culture, especially in the case of death. These are 3 Issei headstones at the Heart Mountain, from the Heart Mountain, Wyoming camp, which were moved to Crown Cemetery in nearby Powell. But you also see them used in other camps. This is Minidoka, Idaho, and an Issei named Fujitaro Kubota, who was from Seattle and was a famous landscaper, created groupings within the camps, and sometimes the meaning isn't completely clear. This particular grouping happens to be behind a sign of all of the people who served in the war, and it's been interpreted as being, because it's behind the sign, as being a symbol of support. These are, here's an example at Manzanar, California, which is kind of an entry stone to a Merritt Park. And here's one at Topaz, which was used at the hospital. And I don't know, is anybody here born at Topaz? Maybe you were born in the hospital and, your mother walked in past this stone, which was set up in October of 42. And Kimiko Mar found in newly digitized images released by the National Archives, there'd been hard copies there, or maybe negatives, but she found this. This is an excerpt, this detail of the opening of the hospital and the christening of the stone, and you can see the stone here in the front of the hospital. And then just going back, right now it's in the field. So what's interesting is that in Japan, there's centuries-long histories of stones in gardens. In fact, in the Heian period, the book that talks about how to create a garden starts with stones. You know, you don't think of Japanese gardens with flowers and rows of formal lines of floral, but the stone is the important element, which also is something that master gardeners have a dialogue with. You don't just put it there and leave it. You kind of try and figure out if it's comfortable there, and how does it relate to everything else in that space. This particular stone was made popular during the end of the Edo period by Hiroshige, and then, like our memes today, was copied by a lot of other woodblock artists because it was so popular. It's actually called the Night Weeping Stone, and a pregnant woman was traveling several centuries ago, and she was killed by a bandit and bled to death on the stone, and ever after, the village people heard the stone crying, and is it the stone crying? Is it the baby of the pregnant mother crying? Is it the mother crying? The legend goes that the baby grew up and eventually avenged the murder of his mother. But at any rate, I thought this was so interesting to see a stone serving another purpose other than being in a garden. So April 1943, James Wakasa was shot, and yesterday we went to his to the sacred space where that happened, and a monument of resistance was built. And so I've been doing research on this ever since 2015, when the Topaz Museum was revising its narrative. And I went to the National Archives, and other people have done this too, but tried to reconstruct his life. Very little is known about him, but we do know from the archives that he probably came here in 1903, although we can't find a passport and can't find a ship manifest. He lived all over the Midwest, all you can see in those dots. And he also spent a little time in New York. In 1941, he was in Long Beach and San Diego, I believe, and unfortunately for him, in 1942, he was in San Francisco at 142 Taylor Street, which is in the Tenderloin, and that picture in the corner is the actual apartment house or boarding house where he was living at that time, and it still stands. And some of you might know the author Clint Smith. He actually went there with us to retrace some of this history as well. He wrote a book called How the Words Passed, about how when people go to sites of enslavement, they're very interested in, he was interested in learning about how that history was told by docents, how it was told by that museum or that prison or whatever, and now he's turning his attention to other people of color. So in April 11th, 1943, so Wakasa was scooped up, sent to Tanforan. He actually made a claim for unemployment because he was in the chef's union. He was a chef. 5 months after arriving at Topaz, he was shot through the chest, killed immediately by a guard named Gerald Philpott on April 11th, 1943, on a Sunday night after dinner at the mess hall. A Pennsylvania newspaper actually called it target practice. The guard kill fleeing Jap, that press release was written by the Office of War Information with collaboration of the Topaz Reports officer, and it's never been corrected. He was shot through the chest, he fell on his back, he was parallel to the fence. That's according to military and WRA records, and then the blood spot was about 5 feet inside the fence. So this is a drone shot taken by Kim Chang, who is a Korean-American photographer who doesn't really know about Japanese-American history, but was traveling and was very moved to see a sign about Wakasa and shared this picture with me. So the green spot is where his barrack was in Block 36, and the red spot is where he died by the fence. And you can see the guard tower, which was 314 yards away. Immediately, a committee formed to discuss this and to protest it, to talk about what to do. It was called the Wakasa Committee. The WRA said Issei, but if you look at it, there are names of Nisei as well, for example, Dave Tatsuno. And when I looked through it, I saw names of people I either knew personally, or their children, or I'd read about them in my research. And they called themselves the Committee of 68. So a lot of committees were forming at Topaz. What they requested was an inquest into the shooting, a federal trial, to hold a funeral at the fence where Wakasa died, and to build a memorial They asked for a lot more, but this is the kind of the summary. And they were holding meetings that were going into 2 and 3 in the morning. And there was just lots of emotion and discussions. Do we have any rights at all? Is there any point in asking for an inquest or federal trial? But this is what they did. The inquest was immediately was denied by the military. The federal trial never happened. There was a court-martial in which the Philpott, age 19, was found not guilty. They were not allowed to hold a funeral at the fence because there was a fear that there might be an uprising, and they were told not to build a memorial. However, we now know that some Issei did, disobeying orders. A funeral was held in the center of the camp. 2,000 people attended, and they sang the Rock of Ages in Japanese. And I talked to Keiya Tabe, who I think is on the board of the Topaz Museum Board, and she was saying her brother talked about remembering being a little kid and sort of, when you're little, you're kind of at the edge of adults' coats, and he just remembers walking through in a sea of legs at the funeral. This monument was built. I haven't seen a picture of one yet, and in the National Archives files, you can see there was a lot of consternation and correspondence between the WRA, between the War Department, various officials saying, what should we do about this? And the monument was only up. We don't know exactly when it was built, but we know that the records say it was up for about 7 or 10 days. And John J. McCloy, the Assistant Secretary of War, wrote to the WRA officials and said, Wakasa's death arose as a result of a justifiable military action, which of course was the same justification for incarcerating us. And the implication was, this must come down. And so there wasn't instructions on how to take it down, and all the records later say that there's nothing left. So this is just an imagined erection of the monument by Patrick Hayashi, who was born at Topaz in 1944. He's an artist. He used to be an administrator at UC Berkeley and taught Asian American studies. But the rediscovery of the monument just really started a fire in him. He just started creating paintings, collages, writing about his memories. He said that when he was a child, his mother talked about Wakasa's death, which confused him. He said because she was such a happy person who really talked about the goodness of people, and it confused him, and he never wanted to think about it again. And he said recently to some of us that he thinks that now it was his mother's way of warning him that it can be dangerous to be an Asian American, a person of color in the United States. So one question is, how did they build this thing? That's a whole other topic, but I just wanted to share this slide from 1939 of the UC Berkeley Botanical Garden, and this tripod for placing a stone was used traditionally in Japan, and Japanese American landscapers in the US used it because the people who built this monument against authorities' orders were using traditional landscaping methods, we believe. Anyway, you can see the Topaz landscape, and Charles Ernst is assuring the War Department that don't worry, it's been taken down, the monument has been torn down, and the rocks which were used have been completely removed from sight. And so anybody reading these files would think, okay, it's gone, it's been demolished. And in the website 50 Objects, when we published this story, we called the story The Demolished Monument because we just thought it doesn't exist anymore. What we also posted in that article was a map or a diagram of the place where Wakasa died. I added this color. This diagram was made less than 24 hours after the killing. And it shows down to the inch, 943 feet and 6 inches, or 314 yards, the distance. So somebody in Block 36 created this map. You can see it's declassified. It was in the archives. I put it in the article I wrote, and a week later I got an email from 2 archaeologists, Jeff Burton and Mary Farrell, that the monument had been found, which was just, I didn't believe it. It was astonishing. And so they went from there. He is the chief archaeologist and cultural resources manager at Manzanar, and Mary is also a retired archaeologist for the U.S. Forest Service. They drove up. There was fires in L.A. He was getting chemotherapy treatments. They just thought, let's get out of the house and try and use this map and see if we can find anything, not expecting to find anything. But when they laid out the tape measure, they found the top of the monument. So you can see how it's kind of camouflaged into the landscape. And it's right 12 feet from the fence. And we know that Wakasa died around 5 feet within the fence. So exactly where the monument was erected is not known. But what happened was an ad hoc committee was set up right away within a few weeks, and it included people from the National Park Service, the Topaz Museum Board, Franklin Odo, the eminent historian, Topaz descendants, survivor, and archaeologists who recommended that the stone be left in the earth. But what we learned was, after the excavation occurred, was that on July 27, 2021, 9 months after that committee got started, 3 Topaz Museum Board members and some local people removed the monument with shovels and what's called a skid steer. The person who did this work has a backhoe company. Earlier we thought, without having seen the pictures, we thought it might have been a forklift. But at any rate, you can see the hole in the foreground. You can see a small camera at the edge of the hole, and you can see the contractor pulling it using a chain on the skid steer, and also with the yellow tie, which is you might have seen on the stone yesterday. This is the monument on its side, and yesterday, for those of you who were on the bus, we were standing right there where the machine is on the right. And so I think what this contractor doesn't know, because he's a professional who's doing his work, but for those of us who are aware of the history, that stone is sitting probably right around the place where Mr. Wakasa's body lay more than 80 years ago. So it's with a really heavy heart that you see this photograph, which was sent to me by Jane Beckwith that night. So it was pulled out on the morning of July 27, 2021, and then people on the committee received an email. Mine began just a quick report. Then it was taken on the wooden construction pallet and a piece of carpet sample to the back of the Topaz Museum, where we saw it yesterday, and it's been there since July of 2021, so over 3 years. Last year, it was in a box, which, because it was made heavy so that heavy woods wouldn't blow it away, was too heavy for people to lift without, number one, possibly damaging the stone, and also injuring the volunteers who were lifting it. So the Wakasa Committee, Wakasa Memorial Committee, which formed after this lifting, has advocated for a proper enclosure, and you saw that yesterday. It didn't occur to me until, actually I was putting this PowerPoint together, but there is now a petition asking for the museum board to release the videos. 2 videos at least were taken of the 90-minute, of the 30 minutes of hand digging and 90 minutes of dragging from the hole, and that's not been released. So the National Park Service, when they did their report, were not allowed to see it, and then a stone expert who was allowed to see it had to agree to many different kind of non-disclosure statements. So at any rate, this kind of actually follows in the tradition of petitions. What also follows in the tradition is finding ways to express your grief and your mourning, your sadness, your outrage. And Mineo Kubo, as you know, in Citizen 13660, documented all the women in all the blocks folding paper flowers for Mr. Wakasa's funeral. Apparently, they were ritually burned after the funeral. Akemi Ina, who was born at Topaz the day after Mr. Wakasa was killed on April 12th, 1943, took it upon herself to create her own homage to the ancestors and to Mr. Wakasa, and put it on the fence at the very first memorial that was held with the National Park Service Assessment and the Topaz Museum Board and others in 2021 in December. Meanwhile, people who hear about this and are sympathetic with the covering up of history and the grief, the buried history that is still coming out and teaching us about what our ancestors did and the history of Topaz. So one thing that's really interesting to learn is that the shot that killed Mr. Wakasa was the 10th shot made by guard tower sentries. And the reason we know this is in the court-martial in Salt Lake City, the Army brought out the records saying, look, people were always trying to escape. We had to shoot. There were examples of 10 shots between December and March. And of course, he was killed in 1943. So that kind of history comes out. And also, the monument has really changed our whole concept of who the Issei were. I mean, this is the ultimate act of resistance, to be told by authorities, don't build a memorial, don't build a permanent thing to remember this person and to show your grief and your anger. And they built it anyway. Of course, it did come down, but at any rate, people now, as they learn about it, are wanting to help remember Mr. Wakasa. And the top left-hand corner shows paper flowers created for a memorial, for the 80th memorial that was held at Topaz with the Topaz Museum Board collaboration. And these are made by Seattle and Portland school children. The person on the right-hand side is 98 years old. Her husband was at Topaz. And the bottom left is an LA company where they heard about it and wanted to get involved. And the bottom right-hand corner are people from Ishikawa Prefecture, where Mr. Wakasa was from. I went there looking for descendants to see if we could invite them to the 80th memorial. Couldn't find any in the short time that I and my husband were there. But people did get together and fold flowers. Even the mayor did, to take to the 80th memorial. And then the media got really interested in why Japanese Americans are interested in Japanese who died during World War II while incarcerated. And NHK did a documentary called Stone and Flower, which I can share the link through Kimiko. So last year there was a 80th memorial, and about, I think, 150 people came to walk from Mr. Wakasa's barrack, retrace his steps to the fence, and think about our history and the importance of not forgetting acts of racial violence, which still continue to traumatize us individually, as families, as a community, and really we should as a nation, even, because this is an American story. And it's also stimulated a lot of art. And so Glenn Mitsui, who is a Topaz descendant, titled this digital artwork, Last Walk. You can see how or maybe you can see just traces of the map that's in there and Mr. Wakasa with his dog. Because it's American history, we've also, at the Wakasa Memorial Committee, been attending academic scholarly conferences, the American Association of State and Local History, the National Council on Public History, the African American Association of African American Museums, and 2 in Japan, because this history is so important, and people are saying that this Topaz monument is not only the most important historical act and the most important monument at Topaz, it's the most important one of all the camps, because it's the only monument which was built as an express protest against the violence that we were subject to and the unspoken terror that really doesn't get written up in the history books. So one thing that's really important is to treasure this sacred land, because up until the monument existed, there was no idea of where the killing occurred. Where was the murder site? And the monument was like this big, it's 2,000 pounds, it's not been weighed, but that's the estimate, piece of crime evidence that says it happened here. For me, the most healing thing that has happened since this happened is to see the National Park Service put up the tape, because it was validation that, okay, history is being recorded. We now know where this crime occurred in 1943 and a heritage crime in 2021. So it's very important to have public archaeology. This yellow line is the fence, the blue spot is where Mr. Wakasa died, the red spot is where the monument was pulled out, and possibly, maybe, where the monument might have been erected, and a public archaeological investigation, it's not a very big spot, might yield more information, more material objects, more information about what happened. They found a small glass bottle, which might mean that there was a floral offering in the 10 days that the memorial was up. In addition, there are other memorials, signs which have been put up, and the bottom right hand is the top of the Wakasa Memorial put up by Japanese Issei. The one on the top was put up by a private boys' academy in the Delta area, I believe through collaboration with the Topaz Museum Board. And interestingly, this 6-foot-tall tree trunk, which says "In Memory Wakasa," it's been around for at least 20 years because it's in an archaeological report of 2002. And then this blue sign were made by an indigenous person. He's a Lakota Sioux whose name is Ron Waxhorse. And I was so moved to find that a non-Japanese American was moved by this murder to make these memorials. And actually, I'd like to ask a Topaz Museum Board member about the blue sign, because actually it was memorialized on Wikimedia, and it says "Small Memorial at the Topaz," I think it said internment camp, sewage pump plant. And then Ron said, "I put it there because that's where the tour began." And I'm wondering if he meant, maybe you can clarify this, Scott, or somebody, that I guess before there was the monument, the place with the flagpole and the parking lot that the JCL created, maybe people began to walk and explore the camp there, because he said that's why he put the sign up there. But after the board put up signs, the blue sign is missing. So I would love to take a picture of it, or have it for historical purposes. And would board members be able to look into that for us?
I think we can look into it, but as we saw, for those of you who came out there, there's not security in that site, so anybody can come out there. And I would like to correct, it was the Topaz board who put out the tape to secure the site, not the
Oh, right, sorry, yeah. Yesterday's tape.
Correct. And so I think there was a question yesterday too, on the tour, if there was vandalism that happens, and the question about a bottle being placed. There have been many reports of vandalism and destruction of property, and as the stewards of the site, the board feels a responsibility to protect the site. So in the open space, and the wide open space, as you saw yesterday, it's a challenge that we have to monitor all those spaces. So it's a challenge to monitor all those open spaces.
So this is where, professional guidance would probably, and funding would help, right?
And the support from the community is very much appreciated.
I think because what's interesting is all of these things have never been harmed. The tree trunk is visible from the road, and this metal sign has not been shot at. And of course, the monument itself was pulled out from the earth, and 2 pieces fell off at the time, and of course it was dragged. So the blue sign, I think, are you saying then that was not removed by the board?
I have no information on that. We don't have any information.
Anyway, so I think what this Wakasa case does is really show how memory of these crimes are so important, and that we as a community need to think about how to protect it, because The tree, I didn't take a picture of it for this slideshow, but it's leaning, it's not maintained. And so when you think about why are these monuments important, Topaz didn't have a cemetery, and our monument was buried forcibly by the government. At Manzanar, the very same year, Manzanar built in 1943 an obelisk in the cemetery to honor the people who would never go home from camp. And as you know, it's become the iconic monument of all the camps, and the Manzanar pilgrimage culminates in a big ceremony at the monument every year. That monument was built by everybody in the camp contributing 15 cents each to build it, and it was built by a collaboration between Catholic and Buddhist priests. The Rower Cemetery in Arkansas is another really important cemetery where there are monuments that, again, are the heart of pilgrimage and the heart of remembrance. Last year, the Jamp pilgrimage went there in 2023. That's the right-hand side. And so Duncan Williams, Professor Duncan Williams, who was in charge of the Eat HO project, has done a lot of work on this and talks about how the interior of the obelisk uses barbed wire as one of the things to strengthen the interior, which has symbolic meaning. And so when we think about it now, this monument doesn't represent just Mr. Wakasa, but all of the deaths, not only at Topaz, there were 140 and 16 military deaths, but the 1,862 deaths, that's according to the WRA, in all the camps, because death has been a taboo subject, which we really haven't talked about, and it's painful. I mean, you hear so many stories of people carrying ashes for years from camp to camp, and, carrying it in a can. And then there were 7 military murders at least. In fact, there were 8, but right now, for documentation purposes, we know that 7 people were killed by the military, and they were Issei. So these are the names of the people who were killed by guards, and 4 were Issei, and 3 were Issei bachelors, which means there were no family members to remember them, and certainly no markers. And so markers are important. And until a decision is made on what's to do with the Wakasa Monument, which, as you see, is still in the museum's backyard, a group of us got together and built our own 21st century paper sculpture. And that's Gail Nambu and Patrick Hayashi in the Bay Area, standing with rattan understructure, and Patrick's tearing tissue paper, and Akemi Ina's applying paper. The man on the right is an artist named Yoshinori Asai, who led the project. And we took it this year in April to the National Council on Public History and talked about the meaning of monuments and why this is so important to not only us, but to everybody in the United States. The Bancroft Library Oral History Project wrote about it in their newsletter, and they wrote movingly about how we held a memorial at Topaz and looked at the archaeological site and then went to the museum to see the stone. And there were people from Texas, New Jersey, North Carolina, Utah, all over who saw the stone. The following day, after the conference, I didn't go, but some of our committee members went to Topaz, and near the site took pictures of it because we wanted to remember what happened. And this paper monument made from our own hands, because those Issei, of course, the last thing to touch the monument from the ground was their hands. And then as they were packing up and ready to go, Yoshinori Asai said, "I think the moon is breaking through," and got this amazing picture. And so this is before it got dark, right near the spot where Wakasa died. The white flowers are used in previous memorial ceremonies to mark the death spot. And then at the Tule Lake pilgrimage, we went and took the monument and talked about the meaning of murder in the camps, buried histories, sources of grief, and how the Issei, how the monument changes the whole narrative of history, that the Issei were passive, couldn't speak English, didn't have any agency. And it's become a very powerful story for all of us, especially at Tule Lake. And so among the 7 who were killed by guards was a young man from Gardena, California named James Okamoto, who was shot fatally by a guard on May 27th, 1944. We took the monument to Castle Rock and filmed it at a place that has geographic recognition and significance for us. And you can see the sky getting darker. Yoshinori Asai had the brilliant idea of illuminating the papier-mâché so it stands out at night. During the day, the Tule Lake pilgrimage took us to the site, which is unknown until now, where Mr. Okamoto was shot to death. And there's no marker there, but people had done some research using WRA records and photographs, and then we made a altar and a remembrance for him, maybe even for the first time. And I talked to his niece. Mr. Okamoto was 30 in 1944, talked to his niece in Southern California, and she said, nobody in the family talked about it. I didn't know he died in the camps until I was 30 years old. I learned at Thanksgiving when the cousins were talking about Uncle Jimmy. And I asked my father about it the next day, and tears came to his eyes, and we never talked about it again. And then she said, and my mother never knew about it, so he really kept it bottled up inside. So you can see the trauma that exists, and how it's so important to have pilgrimages, to talk about these memories, to excavate the history, and to take care of our sacred site, our sacred artifacts, and our history. So I'm going to just end. I'm sorry I've gone on a little bit too long, but there's a really beautiful 7-minute documentary that Claudia Katayanagi made at the Topaz site, and I think Aleko is going to show it for us. Thank you. Thanks. Sorry to run over. We maybe have time for 1 or 2.
Yeah, so if there's anyone who have questions?
Susan?
Hi. I was just going to ask you, when will you be publishing your really incredible research that you've done on not only Wakasa, but on resistance? Because I think that this is so actually part of the healing process for Japanese Americans. I remember when I first learned about the draft resistors and how exciting it was because of the overwhelming story about how everybody just went along with everything. And so anyway, I just wondering when you're going to publish something.
The story just keeps evolving. I kind of feel like we're in the middle of it, because who would have thought that this monument even existed still after 80 years? And then and it's actually venues like this where people can talk and share stories, and it triggers memories that is so important. So that's why I just asked if we could have a little bit of shared time, even though I'm the one who ran over.
Yeah.
But thank you. And also, there hasn't been decided. Oh, go ahead. Who's that? Is that Frank?
No.
I can't see.
I don't think it's Frank.
It's Howard.
Howard. Okay.
Oh, thanks, Howard.
Okay.
Thank you. The lovely story, and what brought to my mind was the idea of a lot of the memories had to be dug up and such. And it came to mind, I remember about 25 years ago, I was talking to a couple of members of 442 and 500th Battalion. And they were telling me the story of fighting all the way up through Italy. And then they were heading through Germany into to a place called Munich. But then they ran into a place, barbed wire fences, and they found out that was Dachau, the extermination camp. And I says, wait a minute. There's no record that the 442 ran into Dachau. But he says, well, what he was alluding to the fact that they were the first to run into Dachau. But can you imagine if the government admitted, yes, the 442 ran into Dachau when their own parents were behind barbed wire fences. And that really hit me. It really hit me.
Thank you, Howard, for sharing that. And just to contextualize it a little bit more, is that was the 522, the Armored Tank Battalion, that was attached to the 442 as well. And there was other issues like that, where I think the 442 were the first to actually liberate Rome, but was asked to step aside until the white soldiers came. So there was a lot of that discrimination that happened, and that's what led to later on in, when Clinton was president, to actually review a lot of the medals that were awarded because they knew that there was discrimination. And that led to a lot of people getting up for their, like, Bronze Stars to Silver Stars or whatnot, and then to the Medal of Honor as well. So that happened a lot, during that time. But I do think that we need to wrap up. We got 10 minutes left until our next presentation. If you do have individual questions, I think Nancy will be down here and she could take them. Thank you.